I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Curtis Miller, another member of the Operation Evaluation Division here at IDA. He's a member of the Test Science Group, and he received his PhD in mathematics from the University of Utah. And he'll be talking about recommendations for statistical analysis of modeling and simulation environment outputs.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's good to have you today. Good to see you this afternoon. Joanna, thank you very much for motivating. Wait a minute. There we go. Thank you very much for motivating my talk. That saves a lot of work for me because I am basically talking about a lot of the statistical methods that she briefly teased in her own talk. So a little bit more context. A lot of what Joanna said, and if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, that means you need to go watch another YouTube video first. But a lot of what she spoke about trying to have some better understanding of an M&S environment and like an overall big picture perspective on what this M&S environment predicts. Maybe there is live data, maybe there isn't, and as she mentioned, there may be a lot of instances where we will never collect live data, like when talking about the capabilities of a threat. We still want to have that overall understanding of how this M&S system performs, and DOT&E kind of laid out some of their concerns and recommendations in a couple M&S memos on M&S VV&A released in 2016 and 2017. So they specifically recommended using statistical metamodels and space filling designs to explore the operational space and characterize model outputs and quantify the uncertainty associated with those outputs. And they describe these methods, but they don't say specifically use this space filling design or use this metamodel, which is appropriate for policy memos. One of the activities of test science since then has been to publish papers that better flesh out these general recommendations. What makes a good space filling design, and how should we conduct metamodeling? So we have a couple papers that have talked about this, and this topic is kind of a summary of those papers. Overall, starting from the beginning, we would like to have a quantitative understanding of how accurate M&S capability is, identify its limitations. This requires appropriate statistical analysis techniques, which, as Joanna kind of described, may not be the same techniques that we would use for analyzing live data. We may want to have techniques that can discover that interesting bumpy surface that Joanna presented in her talk, and that's able to characterize it and quantify the uncertainty associated with it. And if we're going to be using such methods, we should have an appropriate data collection strategy for the M&S and the live data so that we can have a good exploration of that space and discover all of those interesting features. So metamodeling has a lot of applications. Today we're mostly focused on test and evaluation, and there's a clear value in this for like doing VV&A, for maybe even test planning or predicting performance. This could have some application, like making a good metamodel could have applications outside of test and evaluation. Like, for example, if we were doing some sort of campaign modeling, we could have our torpedo simulation metamodel, shove it into the synthetic theater operations research model so that we can have better predictions in that context. Or maybe we can use it for other activities, maybe like wargaming or something, to help improve them as well and extend the influence of the M&S environments that we often are studying. But I am focused mostly on VV&A today. So my motivating example, or my simple example, is going to be a certain type of projectile, a paper airplane. So we're going to be, so instead of having some fictitious simulation of some fictitious missile, we're going to be studying paper airplane flights. And this is just basically solving a set of numerical differential equations that I found in a textbook on flight dynamics that produce a number of different flight paths. And from these flight paths, we can talk about things like whether there were any loops in the flight path or whether there were any bumps, how far away did the plane fly, and try and have a characterization of that response surface. So this is kind of like Joanna's earlier picture of a complex surface, where this is not something where you could very easily have a linear model or a generalized linear model describe this surface. There's a lot of interesting features to it. It's got nonlinear increases. It's got these numerical artifacts. It's got ridges in the surface. It has multiple local maxima and a global maxima, which may not be that easy to see in a 2D plot, but if we go into a 3D plot and spin it around for a bit, we can see that there's a lot of features that a simple polynomial would struggle to capture. So how could we possibly capture all of these interesting features in a response surface like this? And by the way, this is this type of response surface, we get an oracle's perspective on this surface, but in a lot of instances, we're not going to be able to see this surface, right? We're only going to see the response surface at the points at which we collect data, right? So how should we collect data in a way that we can recover such an interesting surface and also properly analyze it statistically? And I in particular am interested in random responses. So if we were to randomize the inputs into these ordinary differential equations, we can now have a random response that it resembles more of the modeling simulation environments that I interact with. So that's what I'm focusing on today. So let's first talk about space filling designs. So a space filling design can help us recover more information about that response surface. So if you were to do our typical d-optimal design of experiments for a linear model and or just a factorial design, we're going to put all the points at the edges of the space. We're only going to replicate those points. And what we end up with is a surface that is not able to describe a lot of those interesting features that we could kind of see in that more complicated surface. So, for example, it doesn't recover where the true maxima is. It increases forever. It's too smooth. It makes terrible interior projections. Whereas if we were to use a space filling design and couple it with an appropriate analysis technique, in this case I use a Gaussian process, but that's actually not what I'm going to talk about today. We're actually able to get much closer to describing that more complicated surface. We get the irregular increase. We're able to rediscover that interesting local maxima on the surface, and so on. So what does it mean for a design to be a good space filling design? There are criteria out there that are meant to describe what it means to be space filling, and we kind of took those criteria, broke them into 3 groups, and then selected a representative criterion from each one. One idea of being space filling is to spread out the points in the space. So there are these types of designs called maximum designs, which maximize the minimum distance between any 2 points in the design. These designs are speaking out to the idea that if you're space filling, then your points are spread out throughout the space, right? That's one way to think of space filling. Another idea of being space filling is uniformity, which means that all regions of the design space are equally well represented. So as an example, figure A, this is not a very space filling design where we just randomly select points throughout the entire space, because there's one region in this design space, the red region, that is overrepresented, and another region, the blue region, which barely gets any points at all. So you don't really have good uniformity since you don't have good representation of all regions of the space as compared to figure B, where the blue region is represented just as well as the red region. This is a Latin hypersquared maximum design, which I'll talk a little bit about in not too long. And then there's a third group of criteria called projection, which is speaking to the idea that a design should be robust to dropping variables. So maybe you discover that a variable doesn't matter after you've collected the data, in which case you're largely going to exclude it from your analyses. The question then is, do you still have something that looks space filling even if you drop those points? So in figure C, if it turns out that the variable x1 doesn't matter, or the factor x1 doesn't matter, all we basically end up with is a replicate of 1 point. So this is poor projection. Whereas in figure D, if we drop the factor x1, it's almost as if it never existed even when we made the design. We still have just as good a description of x2. So we still have just as much space fillingness, if you prefer, in the design. So when we looked at a bunch of space filling design schemes. A lot of these schemes center around the Latin hypersquare, where the idea of the Latin hypersquare is if you're going to have endpoints in your design, you take your continuous factors, split them up into n levels, and make sure that each one of those levels gets hit once. Right? So that's the Latin hypersquare. Here is an example, a visual example of a Latin hypersquare. If I tell you that's all I'm going to do, that actually doesn't give you a unique design. There are other designs there's lots of designs that satisfy that criteria, including just putting all your points in a diagonal line, which is not very space filling. So if you couple that criteria with one of these other criteria, like for example, the maximum metric, which says maximize the minimum distance between all points, then you get something that's much more space filling. We took those criteria, looked at a bunch of different designs and kind of ranked those designs according to these criteria. And overall, the type of design we prefer are these type of Latin hypersquare designs. That said, I haven't really said anything about categorical factors yet. And there will be categorical factors in almost anything of use to anyone. So how do you handle that? There are sliced Latin hypersquare designs, which are able to handle a few categorical factors. There's also designs called Max Pro designs that are able to handle a moderate amount or more of categorical variables too. But still, it's kind of the same basic idea. So that's kind of our general recommendations. And again, there are papers that go into more depth about this. Summary of all I said. If going back to that example, here is an example of a sliced Latin hypersquare design for the paper plane simulation. So in the top row, you see the design points. They look pretty space filling in a two-dimensional space, but all this, as Joanna mentioned, we're often working with like far higher than 2 dimensions. All these metrics are better able to describe what it means to be space filling in those higher dimensions when you have lots and lots of factors. So we collect design points. In the bottom row, we get responses for our paper plane flights. How far did the plane fly? Now, we need to think about how we're going to analyze those data points. And in a paper that should be public soon, TM, we made some recommendations on how you would actually analyze the data that you get out of a design. And today, I'm going to be focusing on generalized additive models. Which is our general recommendation when you have random outputs from your modeling simulation environment. So let's see. There we go. So what is an additive model? It looks a lot like your typical linear model. In fact, for our one categorical variable, the design of the paper airplane, we've got Dart Classic and the world record design. We basically just have a linear term, right? We're just kind of adding up a coefficient for these types of designs. But we also have these arbitrary smooth functions with an unspecified shape. And that shape gets discovered from the data. In fact, these curves towards the bottom are actually, like I didn't say that this was going to look like that. That got discovered. So this is done via a procedure known as smoothing. And we're still able to get a lot of the things that we like from our usual linear models in this framework. Like we can still construct confidence intervals. We can actually plot pictures. It's one of the biggest advantages of the generalized additive model. We have taken the influence of these different factors and we've kind of decomposed them into an additive effect. Right. That is not required, by the way. If I said that, well, airspeed and angle should be interacting with each other, we can have a surface that describes that interaction. But an important part of being able to do something like this is by breaking out these terms, we can kind of achieve, like if we have some 12-dimensional space, it would be hard to understand what an M&S environment is predicting for all of those factors and all the combinations of factors. Whereas if we can find a statistical model that is able to separate out effects like this, that allows us to construct these pictures and it makes some sort of face value validation. Like, does it make sense for the terminal range to have this relationship with angle and so on? So range in this case was a continuous response, but often we're working with binary data. So if we want an additive equivalent to logistic regression, we can do that. We can have binary responses and so on. We can have different types of variables. There's There's lots of things that we can do. So taking the training data, the data that I showed you before, and then fitting an additive model, this is the resulting model. We can come up with these surfaces that describe a typical, that describe the relationship between the terminal range and the airspeed and angle that we input. And to make a prediction with this type of model, we basically just add up effects. So we would take one of these factors, like for example, the dart design, and then add the contribution of the angle factor according to that curve, and then add the contribution to the airspeed of the airspeed factor for whatever airspeed we've selected, and add the contribution of that curve, and that gives us a prediction. So that's all well and good, but how do we know that we're not overfitting? And how do we know that we're actually making, that we have a decent description of our modeling and simulation outputs? We could construct calibration plots. So in this plot, I am plotting the predicted value according to this statistical model to the value that we actually saw in the training data, right? So ideally what we would like to have is that predicted values are equal to observed values. This scatter plot plots that relationship, and from that scatter plot we can ask, does there appear to be that one-to-one relationship between predictions and observations? How much spread is there around the ideal one-to-one line? If there's a lot of spread, that suggests that we haven't actually learned much about our simulation outputs. Whereas if there's very little spread, if it's very narrow, and if it's basically right around that one-to-one line, then that suggests that we've captured most of the variation, and thus have a rather good understanding of how this model is performing. And it's a little hard to see in this picture, but there's this blue line representing that ideal one-to-one relationship, and there's another line, a red line, that is allowed to take any shape, right? Linear, nonlinear, all over the place. It's allowed to take any shape you want, and it also has confidence regions around it. And one question we could ask is that red line, that's rather hard to see, statistically equivalent to the blue line? The reason why that red line is hard to see is because the answer is basically it is, right? This metamodel did a rather good job of describing the relationship between predicted and observed responses. We can even do a statistical test that asks if these two things are equivalent. Under the null hypothesis, we have that one-to-one relationship, and under the alternative, we don't. If we get a large p-value, then we don't reject the null hypothesis and say, all right, we don't have evidence of miscalibration. So that's looking at the relationship between predicted and observed in the training data, right? The data that was used to fit the statistical model. And the thing about that is we would hope that for data the model has seen, it makes a good prediction, especially when it's allowed to take just about any shape. That's not too surprising. So what if we were to give this model some data it hasn't seen before, out of sample data? So I generated another set of data with its own design, and fed that data to the statistical model, but didn't refit the model, right? So now I just recreate that picture with the same statistical model, but with a different set of data, and ask, does the red line equal the blue line? Do we still have that one-to-one relationship when we give this thing data it hasn't seen before? And in this case, it looks like the answer is largely yes. So it seems to also generalize outside of the training sample into data sets it hasn't seen before. This is quantifying how good the statistical model seems to be doing, and also this could be a strategy for if you do have live data. Does the live data seem to match what the M&S is predicting? Because you can take the factors, you can take the live data you've seen, feed them through this metamodel, which is now like a statistical description of the M&S environment, and then ask, does it seem to match? Right? Basically the exact same idea. So that's one application when you have live data. But these papers that I've been talking about, they're not really talking about too much how we compare to live data, but let's suppose that we're working in a regime where live data is very difficult to collect or may not be possible to collect, especially when we're talking about, say, an M&S description of a threat system, right? At the best, you're going to be making some face level, you're basically going to be relying on SME judgment. Does this make any sense? Right, which is when decomposing into those individual functions is going to be important. It's like, does this relationship make any sense? Right. If the answer is no, then that means that this is probably not a good modeling and simulation environment. Right. But this can also help you in other situations too. Like, for example, if you're looking to plan out your testing, having a metamodel like this could help you identify regions where you probably should be collecting live data, like maybe regions of sensitivity. Right? It can also suggest to you when you're constructing a linear model for use for analyzing live data, it can suggest what that statistical model should look like. So for example, the relationship of terminal range with airspeed and angle seems to have these curved shapes, in which case our statistical model should probably include quadratic effects, or in order to allow for such things. So, in summary, we're hoping that people are able to make use of these methods. We think that these methods would allow for better characterizations of M&S behavior, and allow us to quantify uncertainty as DOT has requested in their memos. That's basically it for me. Well, not quite. I also have ads. Like, this was really brief. I talked about a lot of things in my papers, and this slide deck has like 100 backup slides. So, so there's a lot of things that I have not talked about. You can read about space film designs in our space film design paper on the Test Science website, written by me, Kelly Avery, and others. Han Yi, that's right, it was the three of us. My metamodeling paper, which is talking more about the statistical analysis techniques that I've shown, that should be out soon. I've written it, it's had some signatures, it needs more signatures, so it should be out soon. But yeah, that's all I've got.
So happy to take questions in the audience or Zoom land.
Russ Miller, Ida. So when you have these arbitrary shapes that you're using in your metamodel, how do you sort out what's uncertainty from what's in the model? In other words, you mentioned you can still get prediction interval, for example. If I'm trying to get to the uncertainty between modeling, simulation, and test and what makes it up, how do I incorporate, or how do I get that answer from this approach?
So your question is, you want things like prediction intervals, right? Is that the question, essentially?
Yeah, lately people have been trying to take uncertainty and break it into pieces. Like, what's the uncertainty in the input to the model, and what's the uncertainty in the modeling and simulation itself? Is there a way to break out the uncertainties in the
and by uncertainty
approach
in the model and simulation itself, are you talking like we don't know whether we modeled this thing correctly, or more like the statistical type uncertainty that I'm more concerned with here? Like, what do the average responses under these conditions look like? Like, which type of uncertainty are you referring to?
So you have a meta model.
Mm-hmm.
You could have used a physics-based model which had uncertainties in the way it was modeling the physics of it. So when you jump to the meta model, is there a way to get back to the uncertainties associated with the physics?
Yeah.
And also in terms of your inputs, let's say you throw an airplane, but you're not sure exactly what angle you put in, or you're not exactly sure what the final velocity was. So you're putting inputs into this model, but you're not 100% sure what they were. Is there a way to track these kinds of uncertainties in this type of approach?
I think I've heard of techniques that get more towards like uncertainty in the physics and our understanding of the physics and the response. I think there are techniques out there, and I don't think that this is what I'm talking about right now. So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Thanks, Curtis. So in the first half of your talk, you really sold the Maxi-Min LHS
Mhm.
space filling model. Would you recommend that as like the one size fits all space filling DOE, or what other factors do you need to consider when choosing your DOE design?
We had a set of recommendations. Maximin or the Max Pro type designs. I think I like the Max Pro design when I have a lot of categorical factors. It seems to handle that better than the sliced Maximin design, because that one seems to need a slice for every combination of these categoricals. It's like, okay, that's going to be too many. If I've got 10 categoricals at 2 levels each, that's already 1,024 slices. That's not going to work. So those, although at the same time, in my mind, they're largely equivalent designs, those two types of designs. The other major class that comes to mind is restrictions on the space. Like, for example, I've seen papers where they want a space film design for North Carolina, right? So in fact, there was a talk on that earlier, where they fill out the space of North Carolina with points, and they use a fast, flexible filling design. That design is probably able to do a good job when you have those restrictions on the space as well. So those are largely what come to mind for me in terms of broad recommendations. So.
Okay, thanks.
But I guess the answer is, yeah, I really like the LHS, Maximin LHS or Max Pro designs.
Yeah, I think what I got out of it was that you should just go to a space filling SME in the future.
Maybe.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more. Any other questions from anybody here or in Zoom land? If not, we'll take a few-minute break and start the next talk at 4:20 sharp.